Hello, this is going to be a talk about accessible and assistive technology. And straight away to start with, I would like to thank Louise and Olivia at Birmingham Open Media for the help that they give me in preparing for this talk. A little bit about myself. My name is Peter Cheer and I live in Scotland, which is in the north of the UK. I work mostly in the UK, but I have been lucky enough to also live and work in various countries around the world. But I've never been lucky enough to work in Indonesia. A couple of years ago though, I did live for a while in Papua New Guinea, not far from the Indonesian border. And here is a photograph of me and some of my Papua New Guinea colleagues and friends standing outside the district headquarters in Teleformin, which is in Sandaun province. I thought that we would kick off by thinking about what is assistive and accessible technology. In practice, there isn't a great deal of difference between the two. English is a very slippery language with a lot of fine distinctions. And assistive tools or assistive technology, I hope, translates into Indonesian as alat bantu. I've been using Google Translate, so I hope it's done a good job. This means things or technologies used to help or assist people with disabilities in their daily lives, at home, at work, and interacting with others. Accessible technology most of the time refers to things in phones and computers which are designed to do exactly what assistive technology does, make them accessible for people with disabilities and impairments. In practice, we all use technologies in our lives every day, all of the time. Whether it's phones or computers or cars. Assistive technology isn't really that different. It's just that people with impairments need a little bit more help and things which are really designed and customized for their needs. This picture is a march for disability rights taking place in Indonesia. Most of disability rights and accessible technology really involves just thinking and being aware of the special needs of people with impairments, whether it's visual impairments, physical impairments, mental impairments. They exist all over the world, in every society, including Indonesia. This graph shows some figures for disabled people in Indonesia, dating back to 2011. and it was prepared by the Indonesian Ministry of Health. And there are a couple of reasons why this is actually a very misleading graph, very misleading chart. Partly because it's old, so the numbers were changed, but also because it only shows the people who are or were in 2011 registered with the Ministry of Health. There are lots of people who have disabilities and impairments in Indonesia who never actually register with the Ministry of Health. So not only the numbers are wrong, but I would be pretty sure that also the proportions are wrong, with most being blind and physical disabilities, deafness. I'm fairly sure that that's likely to change as well. So why are disability rights and assistive technologies important? Well, the first reason, and to my mind the most important reason, is the moral reason. It's morally important because in every culture, every society, all the faiths around the world, Islam, Christianity, Buddhism, they all stress the dignity of the individual person and the need to show respect. Ignoring people, ignoring their needs, not making adaptations where you can to cope with their impairments and physical disabilities, is not showing them respect. So, the moral reason is important around the world. That's not the only reason though. There are also legal reasons. Indonesia has ratified the United Nations Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. And this picture shows some of the text from the convention, defining what discrimination is. Discrimination against any person on the basis of disability is a violation of the inherent dignity and worth of the human person. So that goes back to moral reasons, because it very much echoes the moral reason, but in legalistic, treaty-like text. And the convention carries on. Disability results from interaction between people with impairments and attitudinal and environmental barriers that hinder their full and effective participation in society. There are lots of people with disabilities and impairments that are never going to get fixed. The doctors can't help them. There's no magic bullet which will return them to normal status, whatever that is. But they have to live with their disability and impairments. What we can change though are the attitudes to them in society and the environmental barriers. The most important environmental barrier that we can think about changing is barriers that exist purely because of poor design. They're easy to fix if people think about them when they're designing stuff. like buildings, street layouts. So those are things that we can and should concentrate on changing. There are all sorts of different assistive technologies for different types of disability, whether it's physical, sensory, mental, but one of the obvious ones, and that everyone notices, are wheelchair users. Wheelchairs are really important for giving mobility to people who can't walk, or people who can walk with a lot of difficulty and not for very far. These wheelchair users that you can see are actually having a fairly good time of things, because if you are in an urban area with paved streets, then getting around in a wheelchair is not so bad. But if you happen to live in an informal settlement where the ground is rough and there's lots of mud when it rains, then even if you have a wheelchair, you've got all sorts of extra difficulties. So the wheelchair is one sort of assistive technology. The world is changing and developing everywhere, and one of the developments is the fact that we're using more and relying on more and more digital devices, such as computers, phones, which mostly rely on the screen. And that's okay as long as you can see clearly. But if you can't see clearly, then having to rely on the screen can cause you big problems. There are people around the world who are blind, who have absolutely no useful vision, and they're all important, but in terms of numbers, there are far more people around the world who have visual impairments, which means their eyesight isn't perfect, although they can see something. And the next couple of slides will show you what a computer screen can look like for certain different kinds of eye conditions that people suffer from. So, first one is an eye disease called glaucoma. And in glaucoma, the central part of the vision, the central thing that your eyes are looking at, is fairly clear, but the edges get blurred. So that's one eye condition. Another common one is macular degeneration. And as you can see, this is pretty much the reverse. Because with macular degeneration, the central part of what your eye is looking at is obscured and you can't see it. But you can see what's going on in the edges of your vision. So on this shot of the computer screen, there's a huge black blur over the centre of the screen, but the edges look reasonably normal to us. And the third eye condition here, Nitrous Pigmentosa, and in this people lose all of their peripheral vision, but they keep their central vision. So what they can see narrows down very much. This quick run through of 3 different eye conditions shows you that even though when people are counting numbers, visual impairments all get lumped in together, the actual effects for individual people can be very different. In some, central vision goes, but the peripheral vision is fine. In other eye conditions, the peripheral vision stays fine, but the central vision goes. And this is an example of a piece of assistive technology for people with visual impairments. So it's no use really for people who are completely blind, but it can be useful for people who can see the screen but just find the text and the lettering and the labels and pictures too small or too blurred. And this gives a magnifier that you can move around the screen, making things easier to find and easier to read. It's something which I like myself because it's very easy to use, and also it happens to be free, which does help. A lot of assistive technology can be very expensive, but there's also a lot which is available for free. And part of my work is explaining to people what they have to pay for and what they don't have to pay for. The digital accessible technologies are quite high tech, but that doesn't necessarily apply to all assistive technology. Because these 2 old people are using walking sticks, and you can't get a much simpler technology than that, but they are a really great mobility aid to people who need them. And this photograph also illustrates the fact that some people are born with disabilities and impairments. Some people get a disability or an impairment through their life by accidents or serving in the army. If we're lucky and we live long enough, all of us will get old, and when we get old we find that we need a bit more help. So things that we used to be able to do when we were young, we can't do anymore. The best form of assistive technology and accessible technology are the bits that you can't see or don't notice. You can't see them or you don't notice them because they're not add-on extras, they're not special, they're built in at the design stage. And this is something called universal design, designing for everybody. So if you were a property developer and you decided to build a new shopping mall in Jakarta, it would be far easier to tell the architects at the design stage that you want the doors to be wide enough for people to get in and into your shopping mall using wheelchairs. Rather than building it, running it for a couple of years, and then deciding, oh, we forgot about the wheelchair users, and getting in the workmen to start widening the doors that you put in the first place because they're now discovered to be too narrow. Universal design means thinking about the needs of all of your users who might be using your building or your service or your computers or your mobile phones or any piece of technology, and building things in at the design stage. Because building things in at the design stage is a lot cheaper and a lot easier than trying to add them on later. If you're a product designer, it's very important to get the views of disabled people who will be using whatever it is you're designing. And the example I've got here is motor trikes for people who have wheelchairs. Any competent motorcycle mechanic should be able to make a motor trike, but unless they've talked very closely with the people who will be using it, you can end up with something which is not safe, doesn't do what users need, or is uncomfortable for them. So when you're designing any product, any service, talking to the people who are going to be using it is one of the first things that you should do at the design stage, because talking to them will make your product better. So that's a quick run through of some different kinds of assistive and accessible technologies. What makes an accessible or assistive technology successful? It's got to be reliable, it's got to work. In Indonesia, people who have hearing problems can go out into the market and they can buy cheap hearing aids, cheap amplifiers for their speakers, but they don't work very well and they don't last very long, both of which are big problems. To be successful, you need to be reliable and you need to work. You also need to be available. Now this might not be a problem if you're living in a major city, but if you're living in a more remote area, then it can be very hard just to find anybody who makes and sells assistive technology. There are also other important considerations like, can you try it before you buy it? lots of people who need assistive technology don't have huge amounts of money, and they want to be sure that the piece of assistive technology they're thinking of buying is going to work for them before they part with any cash. So, can you try it out before you buy it? If it doesn't suit you, can you exchange it? So, all of those kinds of things are important. And this is going back to the importance of universal design. Lots of computers, lots of phones now have accessible technologies built into them. Unfortunately, even though they're built in so people don't have to go out and buy any extras, specially adapt things, the accessibility features are quite often hidden away quite deep down in the computer settings, so that lots of folk who own the computers never realise that this accessible technology is in there. And a lot of what I do in my work is explaining to people, showing to people what is already in their devices, and also giving them training on how to use it. Some assistive technology, like a walking stick, is really straightforward, really easy. You can see what it does. You know straight off how to use it. But some of the digital assistive technologies, like screen readers, that talk to you and read out what's on the computer screen, are quite complicated, and people who are using them need quite a bit of help, quite a bit of training before they're really comfortable with them. That's the kind of thing which I do in Scotland and have also done around the world. And this is an example which is from Google Translate, as well as translating words and phrases. Google Translate can actually speak to you. You do this using the little speaker buttons that I got circled in red. So this is what it sounds like.
Hello from Scotland.
Halo dari Skotlandia.
That is really useful, and it's also really useful for everybody, because even if I can see the word or phrase that I typed in and translated, I don't necessarily know how to pronounce it properly unless I can hear it spoken. So this example from Google Translate shows how assistive technology is not only useful for people with impairments, it's also useful for all the rest of us as well. More and more computers are coming with voice activated features like Cortana, the digital assistant in Microsoft computers. Whether or not you want to use Cortana, the digital assistant, it's entirely up to you. Some people like it, some people don't. But the technology is in there, and for somebody who can't see the screen, it's something that they might have to rely on. You might think that all this business about assistive technology and accessible technology isn't that relevant to me because I don't own a company, I don't design products, I don't design services, which for a lot of people is true, but a lot of people write documents using word processors, and they produce websites, or they go to designers and say, can you produce a website for me? And there are a few hints and tips which we'll run through that give people who use screen readers a more accessible document. The most important tip is to use headers and styles. If you're just a casual word processor user, then you might not understand about headings and styles. So think about writing a document. If you're writing a long report, long document, the title at the top is heading 1, and then the chapter headings will be heading 2, and you can set these up using headings and styles rather than just applying formatting by putting in bold and underline or italic and setting the font and the font size. You can do all that in styles. And if a document or a website is properly laid out with headings and styles, screen reading technology, screen reader programs find it far easier to cope with. If you get a document that hasn't used them, then the screen reader will try to make sense of it. It'll maybe make mistakes, or in the worst possible case, it might just give up altogether and say that that it's impossible to read. This screenshot shows headings and styles from one word processing program called LibreOffice, which is available for free. But you might be more familiar with this example, which is from Microsoft Word. I've cut down the screenshot so it doesn't actually show the entire Microsoft Word program bar, but it just shows what is at the right hand end, which are headings and styles. They're vital, they're really important for producing accessible documents for screen reader users. If you do a lot of work with word processing and writing documents, then it's worth learning how to use headings and styles anyway, because they can be very useful and save you a lot of time. If you're producing video content, think about using what's called closed captioning. So in this example of closed captioning, you've got two people speaking and one is saying to the other, "This is your score from the last test." So if you can hear, then it's fine. You just play the video. But if you find it difficult to hear, or maybe are completely deaf, then you can see two people talking. You have no idea what they're saying, but closed captioning lets you read what they're saying, like it's on the screen. There's closed captioning technology built into quite a lot of goods and quite a lot of digital services nowadays, including YouTube, and it does a pretty good job of writing out what people are talking. So that's video. If you're including audio material, then it's useful to add a download button for giving a transcript of the audio, so that people who can see but can't hear will be able to download the transcript and read everything that was said. So closed captioning is useful if you're doing videos. Transcripts are useful if you're including audio. When you're writing, try and use short sentences, clear language, and a font size that's at least 12 point. If you're writing your document in Microsoft Word or another word processor, you can set the font size, and it starts off really with 8 point, which is the smallest font size that most people can read. And it's absolutely tiny. And as the numbers go up, the lettering gets bigger. So 8 point is about the smallest that's possible for anybody to read. But to make an accessible document, you really ought to be using a 12 point font or even something slightly bigger. But 12 point is about the minimum. If your document or website includes pictures and diagrams, include meaningful captions. And a meaningful caption is a caption that explains what the picture is, not just what it's not. So, for example, if you were showing a map, a useful description would be say, "This is a map of Jakarta," rather than just saying, "This is a map." Because people who can't see and they're using a screen reader, if there's no sensible description, the screen reader will just say or recognize it as an image, but it won't know what sort of image it is or what it's supposed to be showing, what information it's supposed to give, and it will just say image. So full and useful image descriptions are also important. You might be thinking to yourself, well, I don't write that many long documents, I don't write that many reports, I don't design any websites, all of which might be true, but if you're talking to a designer, if you want a website done, you go out, you hire a designer, you're talking to him, you're explaining what you need. Make sure that you insist that the design that they come up with for you has to be accessible. That covers pretty much everything that I wanted to do in a quick introduction to assistive and accessible technologies. If you dig down into the details, then there's quite a lot more, but this is a quick introduction, and thank you very much for listening.